nice to see you all. Thank you all for coming out. I really appreciate it. And today I'm giving an introduction on quantitative EEG. Now for this, you kind of need a basic background of regular traditional EEG, but I'm sure most of you guys do already, so I thought this would be the perfect place to give this talk. So what is quantitative EEG? Well, in simple terms, it's essentially transforming the EEG data from the squiggly lines that we all know and love to colors. But the question is, why change it from the squiggly lines that we already know how to read? What's the point of doing that? So you have to go back to when EEG first started, when we were recording on paper and pen. We were really only able to record essentially short recordings. Now that we have computers, we can record multiple days studies, and that's creating a larger burden on the neurologist to go through all this new data that we're able to capture. So it's good we can capture more data, but 24 hours of EEG is over 8,000 pages if you're looking at 10 seconds at a time. So quantitative EEG, you're able to look at 24 hours on just 24 pages and save some time. So the first pattern we're going to look at is everyone's favorite pattern, posterior dominant rhythm. Got to know your background. That's the first thing you're going to want to look at when you're doing an EEG. And quantitative EEG is going to look like essentially a horizontal stripe. So in quantitative EEG, at the bottom, you're going to have the lower frequencies, the delta frequencies, and at the top, you're going to have the beta frequencies, the faster frequencies. Now, at 10 waves per second, you're going to see a nice horizontal stripe, and that is what is representing the background in this patient. Now, other than looking at the background, another important pattern to be aware of is finding a seizure. And seizures on quantitative EEG look like flames. Now in this patient, this one is abnormal patient in the ICU. So it's starting out, the frequency at the bottom, you're going to see delta frequency, slow waves, and over time, at the end, it evolves. You can see the frequency evolve from the slower frequencies to faster alpha and almost beta frequencies up there at the top. And that flame represents the evolution of frequency over time and the patient's seizure. So other than looking at frequency on an EEG, we also look into the amplitude. So frequency is just waves per second, and amplitude is how high do the waves go. And during a seizure, you're not, a lot of the time, you're not only going to see an evolution in frequency, you're going to see an evolution in amplitude. So in amplitude, in this patient, in this ICU patient, it was initially at 10 microvolts, and during the seizure, the amplitude went all the way up to about 100 microvolts, and it went down at the end of the seizure. And the blue line represents the left side of the brain, and the red line represents the right side of the brain. They're essentially overlapping, so this will show you it's a generalized seizure. It's not just happening on one side of the brain, it's happening on both sides. Now, if we want to take this out to its extreme, I guess, we can take the frequency graphs we were looking at, and we can split it up into 4 different ones. Now, why would we do this? So, when we look at a double banana montage or longitudinal bipolar montage, it's separated into 4 different chains. You got your left temporal chain, which is on the left side of the head. You got your left parasagittal chain, which is on the left, essentially top of the head. Right parasagittal, which is the right top of the head. And then the right temporal, which is on the right side of the head. And the reason for splitting it up like this is so that if there's any focal abnormalities. If anything's different in any of these different panels, it'll jump out to you as a focal abnormality happening in one specific area. But in this example, this is a normal EEG on quantitative EEG. You can see in the middle on each of the frequency graphs, it's at 10 waves per second, very normal EEG. There's a little bit of noise intermixed around it, but that's normal for us to see. When you're looking at an EEG and you want to count the background, you want to look at like the best spot. You're not going to look where there's a bunch of artifacts. So this part where I circled is where the patient's eyes are closed, the patient is relaxed. That's why you can see a clear, nice red stripe at 10 waves per second. And when the patient opens their eyes over here, the red stripe disappears kind of, because that's representing the background attenuating with the patient's eyes opening. So you got the background when the patient's eyes are closed and relaxed, and it disappears and it's reactive when the patient's eyes open. Now, here's another example of quantitative EEG. This is looking at the ICU patient we were looking at earlier. Now in this patient, you've got continuous delta activity at the bottom, and it evolves into 3 distinct seizures. So you got a seizure here, and a seizure there. And not only does the seizures happen with an increase in frequency and evolution, it also increases in amplitude as well. So the amplitude on both sides of the brain is going to go up, and then after the seizure, it makes sense for the amplitude to go back down and be suppressed as it was before. Now, here's an example showing why, a good reason why we split it up into 4 different chains, like the double banana montage, because in this example, we were able to see a focal seizure. So as I said before, seizures on quantitative EEG are represented by flames. And in this example, in the right temporal region, you're gonna see a kind of a subtle little flame. And if you check the amplitude, the average amplitude, it doesn't really rise like it did in the other more obvious examples. So this is a very subtle seizure, and you're always going to want to look at the raw EEG waveforms to confirm that yes, this flame is in fact a seizure and not some type of artifact or something like that. Now in this example, the background starts out, in this area where I drew a box around, the background it's a rhythmic delta theta pattern. There's intermixed sharp waves. When the redness goes all the way up to about the high theta range, that's what's known as a broadband pattern. You can see this in patients who are having consistent periodic discharges. So there's a very consistent, I guess, look to this. The red goes all the way up into the high theta range. It's called a broadband pattern. So when this patient was having this event of this seizure, they were able to call the neurologist. The neurologist looked at the record, and the nurse was able to administer some Ativan to the patient, which got rid of the high amplitude rhythmic delta theta, got rid of the sharp waves, and then the pattern changed from this broadband pattern right here to more of a narrow band pattern. So instead of the red being all the way up here, it kind of simmered down a little bit, I guess you could say. And the amplitude as well went down with it too. So after the Ativan was administered, the patient was essentially left with their original background, which isn't great. You know, it's showing slowing, but if this was the patient's background already and they're in the ICU, at least they weren't seizing anymore like they were over here. Now, this is an interesting example because this one is filled with a ton of artifact, so it's really hard to see anything that's going on. There's really no clear place to count the background rhythm on this one because there's so much artifact. But there are two distinct areas where it looks like there's a flame, like I was talking about earlier. Seizures are represented by flames. We got one here, and we got one here. And not only do we have the flames on the frequency graphs, on the amplitude increases like you would think in a seizure. So upon looking at the raw EEG data, the squiggly lines, did more investigating, and we found that these things that look like flames, they weren't epileptic seizures, they were psychogenic non-epileptic seizures. So these just represent essentially artifact. The patient was moving around, having their event, no epileptic activity, but it is a kind of seizure, psychogenic non-epileptic seizure. So quantitative EEG, it's not going to tell you everything. You should definitely always look at the original waveforms. It can just help you more quickly get to points of interest, like these two areas here, and doctor's able to see that, hey, this is just artifact, and this is a psychogenic event and not epileptic. Now here I have another pretty cool example, I would say. In this patient, if you count the background around 10 waves per second, it's not as beautiful as the first example we saw. It might be a little bit of like a few red specks. It's a little harder to see. Not everyone has, as beautiful background as everyone else. And in this example, this patient, they have epilepsy and they have what is called interictal epileptiform discharges. So in between their seizures, they're having these spike and wave activity, but it only happens for about 1 second. And these interictal discharges are shown by these little choppy flames, very short, quick, interictal discharge, 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 discharge. So you can count and quantify the number of interictals the patient is having. And then also, near the end of this record at 12 minutes, you can see the start of a flame here, and that is the start of a generalized tonic-clonic seizure. And the amplitude going crazy, going way up, off the charts, generalized tonic-clonic seizure. And the reason for being all blue here and here and here is because the wires actually came off of the patient's head during the generalized tonic-clonic seizure, because those can be pretty intense, that's for sure. And in this panel, it's all red, that's just artifact, because the wires are just off the charts going crazy. Now, in this example, we have what is called vertical stripes. In this patient, it starts out, it's mostly just delta activity at the bottom with these stripes that come at almost a regular interval. Now, the kind of pattern that is shown in here is called a burst suppression pattern. So you have essentially completely suppressed slowing and then a high amplitude burst. Completely suppressed slowing, high amplitude burst, and it keeps continuing. Slowing, burst, over and over again. And that can also be confirmed with the average amplitude. It starts at around 10 microvolts, jumps all the way up to an average of 100, down to 10, 100, 10. So it's pretty much going from flat line to over 100 microvolts over and over again. And that, my friends, is a burst suppression pattern on quantitative EEG. Now, the last pattern I want to show you guys, it's where it all ends. This is a completely suppressed EEG. You're going to see just all blue. And the reason for these little specks on here and big increases in amplitude is because those are points in the record where the nurse is moving the patient and the electrodes are essentially going crazy. I'm sure you guys have seen that in your ICU patients. So completely suppressed brain death pattern, it's going to look like all blue, and the amplitude is essentially 0. So just to recap, I want to make sure you guys at least can get the basic patterns down. Posterior dominant rhythm, it's going to be a horizontal stripe. I'll go back and show you guys real quick. So it's going to be a horizontal stripe with the eyes closed, relax. And then when they open their eyes, it attenuates. That's the posterior dominant rhythm in a normal patient. And then the next one, we have seizures, which look like flames. And we got a flame here, which eventually turns into artifact. For the generalized tonic-clonic seizure, we got a focal flame here in the right temporal region to show a focal seizure. And we have these generalized seizures of this patient in the ICU as well. And then the next pattern is a broadband pattern, which sometimes can be dangerous. You can see periodic discharges where it's just consistent, discharge, discharge, discharge at a consistent rate. And that's going to be looking like this pattern right here. But it's also important to keep note that it could also be caused by artifacts, so make sure it's clear and not artifactual. So this is broadband pattern right here, and then here's a narrowband pattern where it's essentially just slowing, where you can see that in encephalopathic patients or in sleep. And what else do we have? We got major artifact, you're gonna see is all red. We got some artifact here. We got major artifact there. And essentially when the generalized tonic-clonic seizure, and when they're in the middle of it, it just turns into all artifact as well. Major artifact in the psychogenic non-epileptic events, all red. Usually, if it's looking like too much, just like in regular EEG, if there's way too much, it just looks like too much, it's probably artifact, essentially. What else do we have? And we got burst suppression, which is shown with vertical stripes. And we finally have suppression, complete suppression, cerebral inactivity, which is going to be represented by all blue, nothing going on, and besides a little bit of artifact. And that, my friends, is my talk on quantitative EEG. Anybody have any questions?
What time frame do you find seems to be most effective in your LTM for looking at the quantitative EEG?
Yeah.
I know it can go up to 12 or 24, but
Yeah, very good question. So he was asking, what is the best time base or time frame to look at EEGs when looking at quantitative EEG? So that's a very important question. So I usually like to look at about an hour at a time, because if you look at too much on one page, if you try to look at 6 hours on one page or 12 hours on one page, you can miss more subtler things like very short seizures. Maybe if the seizure is like 15 seconds, if you're looking at 6 hours, it's not really going to show up very visually well on the quantitative EEG. You won't be able to see interictal discharges as well, and you won't be able to see subtle focal slowing. Sometimes you can't even see subtle focal slowing and interictals on this because they're so small. And quantitative EEG, it's just averages, so always look back at the original EEG waveforms. It's just a way to help you navigate the record quicker and get to the major points of interest. So I'd say usually about an hour at a time per page. Any other questions? Yes?
Would you say this is easier to teach nurses, like in ICU, about maybe phenylketonuria to actually be able to monitor versus the discharges on the EEG itself for administration of more phenylketonuria?
Okay, so when it comes to, I guess, educating nurses on this, I think it might be a little bit difficult because it's just like regular EEG. Quantitative EEG is a little bit prone to misinterpretation, especially if you're not trained very well. And I think you really need to have a good basic knowledge of regular EEG before looking at this, or else you're not really going to know what you're looking at. For example, say a nurse was looking at this and they saw all these flames. They might think they're having epileptic seizures and all that, but it's usually just going to be a lot of artifacts. So I think it'd be difficult to teach nurses how to do this, and it'd be nice, but I don't know if we can. It takes our expertise and our knowledge as EEG techs, I think, to really understand this.
I have a question here.
Yeah.
What qEEG software are you using?
Oh, so this software that I was showing on the screen, this is my own software. It's called ION. Some of you guys are familiar with different quantitative EEG software. It's called Persist, but I decided to make my own version. So, when you make your own version, you can put whatever you want in it. That's, I get to do my own thing. So this is my software, ION. Working on the FDA clearance, and day by day, guys, day by day. But thank you for the question. Any others?
What was it about Persist that was lacking that made you, go your own way, which I think is amazing, but.
Right. So what was lacking in Persist that made me want to start my own version? So, well, I tried to work at Persist. I applied, but they didn't answer. So that's the first reason. And then number two is, I don't know if you guys have seen, but their seizure detection software, they got a lot of false positives. I was thinking, I could probably do better, because my brother and my dad, they do programming. We've been working together on this, and I think we're gonna create a much better software than Persist. That is our goal. Yes?
You just mentioned Persist has a lot of false positives. From your clinical experience,
Mhm.
what would you say would be the false positive rate? Per day, how many hours?
Okay, so it really depends on the patient. If the EEG is essentially a very normal EEG, there's going to be less false positives, maybe only a couple per day. But if the background is already abnormal, let's say a patient with Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, I've seen over 100 false positives in a 24-hour or 12-hour shift of monitoring a Lennox-Gastaut patient. So not only false positives on seizures, they have false positives on the interictals as well, the sharp waves. So I think even our software still has a lot of false positives as well. I think it's just computers need a little bit more time to advance, and nothing beats us humans right now. So, anyone else? All right. Oh, one more.
If you had one area you could not use your program, and you had it on the machine, where would you take it? Would it be NICU? Would it be children's?
If I could use this in one area, so quantitative EEG, it's best used in the ICU. That's the best place to use it. And Yeah, so mostly any long-term recordings are the best for it, but if you're looking at a routine EEG, I guess you could look at the trends on just one page just real quick, but if it's just a 20-30 minute EEG, you can probably just scroll through it traditionally. But if you're looking at 24-hour studies or even ambulatory 72-hour studies, I think quantitative EEG can help you go through it a lot quicker. All right, if no one else has any other questions, I think that's it. Thank you guys.